Hey kids, let's talk about the good old days growing up in Idaho. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Growing Up in Idaho. Today we're going to talk about Mike Hicks. He recently celebrated his 80th birthday. 80 years. That's a long time. But it suddenly came reality to me when I realized that my dad is only about 22 years older than me. So I'm getting close to that age too. And it's not frightening, but it is concerning. But I wanted to talk a little bit about Dad and some of the things that he believes in and a little bit about his character. We talk a lot about his police stories and the stories from, when he grew up in Salmon, Idaho, and some of those mining camps in and around Salmon. But I really want to focus today on some of the character traits of Mike Hicks. And because I think that kind of speaks to his whole being. So let's start out when he was a little kid. Just 3 or 4 years old. Like I said, he grew up in the mining camps of Idaho. And his dad was a hard rock miner. And those mining camps were full of really colorful people. And one of the things that some of those miners would do is they'd get those little kids around them and teach them how to say swear words. And if the little kid could say a swear word really well, he would get a nickel. And so Dad was involved in that as a little 3-year-old, 4-year-old kid. And he was making a lot of nickels. He got a lot of money. In fact, he probably had more pocket change than his dad. But as a result of that, he grew up learning to swear really well. I mean, those swear words came out really well. And it was concerning for his parents. But as you probably guess, when you learn to swear when you're a little tiny kid, it doesn't easily just leave you. I mean, you keep that habit forever. And to Dad's credit, he got over the swearing habit. It's taken him about 80 years, but he doesn't swear much anymore. And that's a credit to him, and I'm proud of him. I don't want to sound condescending here as his son, but I'm really proud of my dad for getting over that habit. It's something that he doesn't like doing. And especially since when he was young, he got religion, started going to church, and he was a teacher and a high school administrator. And so swearing is something that he wanted to leave behind, and he eventually accomplished that. When Dad and Mom were teenagers, they met one summer when Dad was working in cobalt. He was about 14 or 15 years old and would drive over the hill into Cobalt on the weekends to work in his brother-in-law Carol Jarvis's gas station. And that's where Mom ran into him, and they knew each other. Mom was a year behind him in school, but they knew each other, but they didn't get together until they were 14 or 15. And once they got together, it was serious. And except for Dad's senior year, they were together that whole time. Dad moved to Chalice, Idaho, and graduated from high school there, working for Carol and living with Carol and my Aunt Carla, his sister. So anyway, that's kind of how that went. But Mom and Dad's love story started out really kind of fascinating. Mom was a good Mormon girl. And Dad was kind of a rough and rowdy guy. Had a fast car. Kind of a rough-looking character. Drank a lot. And Mom came along and encouraged him to stop doing all that stuff because, like I said, they got serious. And Mom said she's going to be married in one of the LDS temples. And if Dad wanted to come along, he was going to have to straighten up. And so he did. And so Mom was a huge positive influence on his life. And here's something else that's interesting. Because of our family heritage, the Hicks family, in fact, all of the members of the family through that line, education was not a big deal. And once people turned 16 years old or so, they dropped out of school and went to work. That was just kind of the Hicks family tradition. But once again, Mom influenced Dad, and he also had some teachers that had a great influence on him, and he decided to finish high school. And incidentally, he went on, as we'll talk about here in a few minutes, he went on to college, which was unheard of for anyone in the Hicks family. So anyway, Mom was a big deal in Dad's life, and he fell in love with her and wanted to do what she encouraged him to do, which was to straighten up and get religion in his life. And so that was a big deal. And we're all happy for that because, all of us kids, 8 kids, grew up in the church, the LDS church, and had a solid foundation for our spiritual lives in our religious lives. And we appreciate Mom and Dad for heading down that path. And like I said, Mom was a huge influence. And thankfully, Dad fell in love with her and went along. So, like I mentioned, Dad wanted to become something more than just a common laborer because he had some ideas, and it required that he go to school, to college. And he had this idea in his mind that maybe he would be a good teacher and could influence young people's lives and help them, kind of like some of his teachers did when he was young. And he wanted to have that positive influence on kids. So Mom and Dad moved to Boise, Idaho in the early 60s. And when I came along in 1964, that's where they lived. And Dad started school there after making a little bit of money and once he figured out how the school system worked and how you could get in and get grants and loans and scholarships and things like that to help you pay. And so he got enrolled in school. But to pay for his life, to support the family, he became a police officer. And he was a deputy sheriff there in Ada County in Boise. And that's what he did while going to school. So he worked full-time as a sheriff's deputy, went to school full-time, was a full-time dad, and husband. And also, people in the LDS church don't just sit around. That everybody has a job to do, a position in the church is what they call it, or a calling. And so anyway, needless to say, Dad was a busy guy. And when I was born, my parents were fairly well settled. I was the second kid. I had an older brother, Mike, who welcomed me into the world with beatings. I don't think Mike really liked having a little brother for a while. But anyway, we grew up to be good friends. But when we were kids, we weren't good friends most of the time. I was constantly getting chased around and threatened and beaten on. Anyway, that's a whole different story. But but mom and dad started their family while everything else was going on. And we've all heard Dad's police stories, and we'll hear more of those. In fact, I'm recording a lot of his life history, and that includes a lot of those police stories. We love those stories. Everybody who is a student of Dad's in social studies or any class he taught in junior high school has heard all of those stories. They're good. And like all good stories, they get a little bit better every year, every time they're retold. But we don't mind that. Because here's the thing. Dad had a message. After each story, there was a moral of the story or a lesson to be learned. And, with police stories, people doing things and suffering consequences, there was always a lesson. So we all enjoyed those stories. We loved them, in fact. And as his kids, we heard them all over and over. And, the tradition of storytelling is really big in our family. And we loved it. We had no problem with that. So Dad was a teacher. After graduating from college, leaving Boise behind, we all moved back to Salmon, Idaho. That's where Mom and Dad grew up. And that's where most of the family was. So it was like coming back home to them. And Dad became a teacher in the Brooklyn Junior High School there in Salmon, 7th grade. So when I entered junior high school, when I became a 7th grader anyway, I had Dad. And let me tell you a little bit about how things were in those days. You can't talk about growing up in Idaho and talking about the good old days without at least mentioning something about the paddling that went on in schools. Back in, when I was in elementary and junior high school, that was a thing. A lot of teachers had huge paddles, and they'd hang them on the wall behind their desks so every kid who entered the classroom would know that could happen to you if you don't keep, doing what I asked, and if you get out of line, that might be a problem. And there were some kids who got paddled. I know a lot of them. Fortunately, I was able to avoid that somehow. But as far as Mike Hicks's paddle, I got paddled at home. I wasn't immune to that. All of us kids got paddled. In fact, we didn't have a big school paddle. It was Dad's police belt. He'd wear this big thick leather belt that he was left over from his police days, and he'd pull that belt out. And when we were kids, when we saw that belt coming off, we knew whatever we did, we had pushed the limit. And so anyway, paddling was a thing. And teachers would also come up to you if you were out of line and whack you behind the head, or, pull those little short hairs behind your ears but down by your neck. Or whack you with something like a ruler or a yardstick. Anyway, it wasn't as brutal as it sounds. But those were just methods that were legal in those days to keep students in line. And so Dad, was famous for being the designated paddler in Brooklyn Junior High. It was a crazy time. And I remember a few kids getting out of line. Dad would say, "Get out in the hallway." And the kid would be like, "Oh, uh-oh." He'd go out there. Everybody'd be really quiet in the classroom. And you'd hear a whack. And then the door would open, and in would come the kid, and Mr. Hicks would be following behind. Usually, especially if it was a boy, he'd be trying as hard as he could to keep a straight face or smile even. No, that didn't hurt. But we knew it hurt. Anyway, those were the good old days. But Dad was a good teacher. And I know because I had him. And here's kind of the method he would follow. Like I said, he had a lot of stories. If he wasn't telling police stories, he was teaching his social studies or his history classes using stories. We learned about all the characters or the players in each of these times in history or whatever event was being taught. And that's a good way to teach. And he would have projects and things like that he would help the kids learn from. And he was very interactive with the kids. And of course, that's how he operated at home as my father. He's very interactive, very hands-on with all of us kids. And he was a good dad, happy most of the time. And when he was angry about something, we just learned to stay out of his way and give him some space. But anyway, that's how it worked. And Dad was a good father. And he was a good example. Now, keep in mind, he came through those rough and tumble days growing up in the mining camps. And so, being one of the oldest kids, I still saw the Mike Hicks as a father that was still trying to shed a lot of those rough and tumble ways. And I could tell that Dad was trying to learn to be a different, better person, to be kinder, to be more helpful, and to not beat the hell out of people if they got on his nerves, because that was something that he grew up with. And as you know, if you grew up in those days, fist fights occurred fairly frequently. If somebody smarted off at somebody else, or if somebody, especially this, if somebody was rude or disrespectful to a woman, there would be a fight. That woman's husband would come along, or a boyfriend or whatever, and pound the daylights out of the other, whoever was being disrespectful. That's just how it worked in those days. So that's what Mike Hicks was kind of all about. And he had to learn to get over that mindset because he was trying to be a better person, trying to be kinder. But I still remember him getting upset with people, and he'd walk over to them and grab them by the shirt front and tell them to behave themselves. And, and those were interesting times. But I can say that it was a time where Dad was trying to be a kinder, better person. So after teaching for about 10 years or so, Dad decided that he wanted to either get out of education altogether and maybe buy a business and be a businessman in town, or go back and get more education so that he could be an administrator. Actually, he wanted to improve himself, but he also wanted to make more money. Teachers in Idaho don't make much money. And he wanted to improve and increase his paycheck. Well, he finally decided to go back to school and get his master's degree, which would give him the opportunity to maybe move into some administrative positions in education, like a principal or vice principal or whatever. And he decided that the place for him was BYU. That's where he wanted to go. I don't know why he chose BYU. It's probably because it's a church school, and he'd heard a lot of good things about it, and they had some excellent education programs there. So that's probably the reason. So he went down and talked to the bigwigs, the BYU, to see what it would take to get enrolled there. And they laughed. They said, first of all, you don't have good enough grades to get into this high and mighty school. So there's that. And I just don't think it's going to work for you. Maybe go find some other, like go to a state school or something. Well, Dad wasn't going to take no for an answer. And he said, look, BYU is where I want to go. And I'm determined to get my degree here. So what do I need to do? I know there's got to be a way. What do I need to do to get into this school and get a degree here? And the person thought, well, man, this guy's serious. He said, well, here's what we can do. If you come down during summer term and enroll in a full load of classes, and you do really well, you get good grades in those classes, then we'll talk about letting you in. So Dad said, okay, that's what I'll do. So right after school ended in 1978, he moved down to Provo, Utah, where BYU sits, and enrolled in school. That's what he did. And left the family home to fare for ourselves. Anyway, he was down there that whole summer all by himself, living in the dorms, and he got straight A's. He did really well. And he didn't surprise himself because he knew he could do well, but he surprised all those high and mighty BYU professors and made believers out of him. And so we were really proud of Dad. Now think about this. Dad didn't have any room for failure. If he would have flunked out at that summer term, he would have lost that whole summer of potential earnings because he wasn't working. And he would have had to figure out something else. Probably come back and be a teacher again or something. Anyway, he had to succeed, and he did it. He did it. Did a great job, and we were proud of him. And so that fall, we all moved down. The whole family moved to Provo. Now here's the crappy thing that happened about that whole Provo move. I had just fallen in love with Sarah Simmons, a little 7th grade girl. And, I was in 8th grade, and she was, to me, the most beautiful woman I had ever seen in my life. Finally gotten up enough nerve to sit down beside her, and I was a shy kid, so trying to figure out how to communicate with somebody as gregarious and pretty as Sarah was a big deal for me. Finally, I managed to get to that point. We fell in love, and now Dad announced we're all moving to Provo. We're going to be gone for a year. And that was horrible. I didn't know what I was going to do. I actually entertained the idea of trying to talk my parents into letting me live with my grandparents while they all went off on their little journey, their little adventure to Provo. But nobody was going to have that. We were all going to be there as a family, and that was final. So anyway, I said my goodbyes to Sarah, knowing that 3 hours after I left town, she'd have a new boyfriend. But anyway, it was, I knew that once we moved back after a year, perhaps I could figure out a way to get back into her good graces. Now I have to say, once we all got to Provo, I realized this is a great place to be. There's a lot of activities. There's a lot of fun things to do, not only with the school I went to there, meeting all the kids, doing all the fun things that city kids get to do, like go to the show all the time for cheap, going out to fast food places all the time. And so it wasn't bad. I learned to like it. But when Dad graduated from BYU with flying colors, nearly straight A's. I think he got 1 B+ in a class. He sat and had heartburn over that for a while. But he did really well. Was near the top of his class. in his master's program. And he got offers from other places that not only paid more money, but that would be nice places to live and finish raising his family. So Mom and Dad, I heard them in their little whispering, little power meetings they were having in their bedroom. I heard the possibility of not moving back to Salmon. And I was horrified. How would I get back with Sarah if we didn't move back to Salmon? So anyway, you all know what kind of vote I put in when it was put to the family. What does everybody want to do? Because here's some options that we have. One of them was to move to American Samoa. He got offered a job out there. I said, I don't want to move to Samoa. I want to move back to Salmon. It's where all my friends are. So anyway, it was kind of the way everybody else thought too. And so, Dad looked around at some opportunities there. It just so happened they finished the new high school in Salmon, and they were looking for a dean of students. And he applied for that and got that job. It was fantastic. So we loaded up and moved back home. And Dad, it's interesting to see how, to a kid anyway, how your parents progress. And that year in Provo did a lot for Dad. He learned a lot, and he understood education better. He had a more expanded perspective of his profession, his professional life, and how to deal with students, how to run a high school, how to run any school, how to deal with people. Now, Dad had a lot of natural abilities to get along with people. Yeah, and he's a natural leader. But he learned a lot of how to be a good manager and how to lead people in a school setting. And so, once again, we were all proud of him. As his son, I noticed some changes in Dad and in his bearing, his demeanor, the way he operated. And I was proud of him. And he did very well as the dean of students. Got along well with the kids and did a good job. And but you know how things go. When you're trying to improve yourself, pretty soon you get to a pinnacle where you're ready to expand your horizons. And it wasn't long after I graduated from high school that Mom and Dad were looking around for some places to go. And they found a really good opportunity in Wyoming, of all places. Now, because I was graduated, I didn't care where they moved. They could go anywhere. It wouldn't matter to me. So they ended up in Wyoming, a little town called Lyman. You probably heard of that. And Dad moved the family there, and that's where he set up to continue his education profession. Now, in all, Dad worked nearly 40 years as a teacher and administrator in the education business. And he had a lot of successes. And I want to get out in the weeds a little bit and talk about some of those, what I considered great successes that Dad had. I mentioned he's a good teacher and had a lot of abilities to convey information and help students understand it. But as an administrator, he was in a position to help kids even more. And he had a great influence on a lot of kids. And I can think of a few friends that I have in my own class that he really helped out. Every kid goes through phases in their life, especially when they're young. And I had a few friends that were struggling along in their life. And, when you get into your teens, 15 or 16 years old, sometimes your parents don't have much influence on you anymore. So other people have to step in and help out. And we understand that that's just how it works. And because of Dad's position as an administrator, he was able to, at least from an education standpoint, he was able to help some of those kids who had some needs that he could help especially with. For example, one of my friends decided it was time, to quit school. He didn't want to go to school anymore. He didn't see a need. Kind of like all of my Hicks relatives that never finished high school. They went to work. Just seemed like the best thing to do. And this kid, Dad was concerned about him. He hadn't showed up in school for a while. So he went down to the kid's house eventually and said, "Hey, you got to come to school. We can work things out. You can do some things differently and maybe find some successes there, because frankly, I don't want you to quit school. You have the potential to go a long ways with an education." And one of my other friends, Dad was able to set up a special education program for him so that he could live out on his own and keep his class credits going. And school just wasn't working out, the normal walk into school setting and being taught in a classroom wasn't working out. And so Dad set up a program so he could, it was kind of like homeschooling in a way, but the same curriculum that we were all following, and it was very good. One of my closest friends, and it helped him. And anyway, those are things that I noticed. And in that nearly 40 years, 39 years to be exact, that Dad was in education, he had and took a lot of opportunities to help kids. And once again, I'm proud of him for that. He was talented. Yeah, and he used his influence to help people. Not penalize them, not, be petty and kick them on down the road if they weren't doing something that he approved of. In fact, I think one of Dad's biggest virtues is his understanding of people who may be taking different paths in life. Because that's kind of how Dad was when he was a kid. He was kind of a rebel. And so he had an understanding, maybe, for how those kids thought. And he was able to reach out and communicate with them. And I think that's probably the most important thing. He spoke their language. He understood them. And one of the other things, and this is the last thing I'll talk about as far as Dad's education, his profession goes, Dad had the ability to be fair. And, when you're dealing with kids, that's probably the biggest thing in a lot of ways is being able to be fair in the situation. You might have to discipline a kid or set up some kind of a program that they're not going to like to help them improve. And Dad was able to do that and be fair. And that's a big deal. And as a kid growing up in his home, I saw that same thing. Dad was a disciplinarian. He expected us to toe the mark. We had some rules. We had some boundaries. We couldn't mouth off at Mom, for example, or we'd get our butts kicked. He wouldn't allow that. And we had to get our chores done, and we couldn't just mess around and put things off. There was a timetable we had to work on, and But, we were all kids. We had quite a bit of freedom. And Dad was able to help teach us and work with us. And all the kids in the family grew up understanding those principles and of discipline and getting things done and being a person of your word. If you say you're going to do something, then you do it. You follow through and make sure it gets done. So incidentally, I don't know if you know this, but Dad was Principal of the Year in Wyoming one year. I can't remember the exact year, but it was in the later 80s, as I recall. Got to go travel back east with all the other principals of the year and to Washington, D.C. or somewhere out there in the east where, I'm pretty sure it was Washington, D.C. And, be treated, wined and dined. Got to listen to some great speakers. It was a big deal. And we were proud of him for his accomplishment there. Now, what I want to end on here is talk for just a few minutes about Mike Hicks's faith in God. Because as his son, I watched him, like I alluded to earlier, I watched Dad literally grow up. When I came along, he wasn't too far out of his teens yet. In fact, I think he was 21 to be exact when I was born. And maybe he was 22, but he and Mom got married when they were teenagers, and he was still learning a lot and growing. And as a kid, I watched him grow up. And one of the things that Dad always demonstrated was a strong faith, strong belief in his religion and in Jesus Christ. And he tried to practice the gospel of Jesus Christ, doing good to his neighbors and loving people and being kind and helpful and serving others. That's kind of a big word in the religious community, service. And let me give you, here's a story about how Dad thought about service. As you may know, the LDS church has what they call a seminary. It's just like a high school class, a religious class for high school kids. You learn about the scriptures, the Bible, and the LDS scriptures, the Book of Mormon, and the other scriptures. You learn about all those things and you study them, and it's just a religious class. And Dad believed wholeheartedly in seminary. And he encouraged all of his kids to go to seminary and graduate. And Dad taught seminary, early morning seminary. It means the class started at like 5:30 or 6 o'clock so that the kids could go and then have enough time to get over to their high school classes. And there were some kids in Salmon there that lived out by Baker and quite a ways out of town. And they couldn't get into seminary. And that was the only class, early morning was the only class being taught. And Dad wanted to help them to get into class. Their family was struggling and they couldn't get in. So he would get up earlier than necessary and drive all the way out to Baker, pick up those kids and bring them into their seminary class. And he did that this whole year. The whole school year. And as a kid, I watched that. That time I was 7 or 8, maybe 9 years old. And I watched my dad doing that, and I learned from his example that that's one thing you can do. When people are struggling along and you have the means to help, and you're willing to step in and sacrifice some of your own resources and time, to help someone else. I figured that out by watching Dad. And that was a big deal for me as his son. And I appreciate him showing me that example. And I saw that same type of thing through my whole growing up years. Dad had this idea, this philosophy, that all of your time using your car to serve other people, those miles wouldn't add up in the mechanical sense. Your car would not wear out if you were driving out to help pick kids up to take them to seminary, for example, or if you were taking the scouts on a scouting camp trip, or if you were doing some other thing to help serve other people, your car wouldn't wear out. Now, here's the interesting thing. I think Dad was right, because all the cars that we owned when I was a kid, we drove those cars forever, 250 to 300,000 miles. And you know, for a 1970s automobile, that's a lot of miles. In fact, it's almost miraculous. Cars nowadays get that kind of mileage easily. But back in those days, if you got 100,000 miles on your car, back in the 70s, that was considered a big deal. You had bragging rights, in fact. So anyway, those are some things about Mike Hicks that I thought would be interesting to talk about for this podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. And we'll keep these stories going, talking about the good old days. Have a good day. Thanks for listening. Thanks for listening. Growing up in Idaho, the good old days.